Good morning, everybody. The title of this panel is Intelligence in the 21st Century, which is as wide as diffuse. We have 75 minutes. I will open with a short introductory and presenting our distinguished guests, and then start the discussion. They gave me an earpiece, so I'll get a strict warning when our time is up. And so we need to keep it as short and concise, and I think that we have the right people to do so. Before making the introduction, I would like to share you one memory. This is not the first time for me. I just recalled facing or participating in a panel called Intelligence in the 21st Century when I was a PhD student in Cambridge. In early of last decade, there was a class called History of Intelligence and a specific lesson called Intelligence in the 21st Century and Counterterrorism. And the professor came that day to Cambridge and said, Professor, which I'm not going to name, not to embarrass him, and said, ladies and gentlemen, I know that I need to teach you about intelligence and about the importance of intelligence, the future of intelligence, the importance of intelligence and counterterrorism, but to tell you the truth, I think it's not relevant. I think intelligence is not relevant. It never was relevant. It didn't have a real effect on history. And you know, terrorism nowadays, well, maybe in the past, but there are more important topics on the world agenda. Just to add one fun fact, this meeting took place on the 5th of September 2001. The professor doesn't teach anymore in Cambridge. So I think that there's no debate today on the profound importance of intelligence. And I think we have the right people to discuss this. The first one, to my left, Secretary Michael Chertoff, is a lawyer who served as a federal prosecutor and as the Assistant U.S. Attorney General. In 2005, he was appointed U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, a job in which he had to deal with much of the repercussions of 9/11, co-authored the famous Patriot Act. Upon retiring, he became the executive chairman and co-founder of the Chertoff Group, which, if I may add from a personal knowledge, reside in one of the most beautiful buildings in DC and with the best views. So if ever Secretary Chertoff invites you, do not miss the opportunity to visit. Secretary Chertoff is leading the GlobSec Intelligence Reform Initiative. We just produced an excellent report on the future of intelligence, which hopefully we'll be able to refer later. Thank you for being with us, Secretary Chertoff. Dick Schoof, National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism at the Ministry of Security and Justice of the Netherlands, The Hague. And Mr. Schoof is at the center of a unique attempt to try and create an interdisciplinary, interagency coordination entity that would better fight counterterrorism in Holland, and hopefully he will be able to tell us more later on. John Frank is the Vice President, EU Government Affairs, and is leading the Microsoft Brussels office. Prior to this role, Frank was, and I hope I pronounce this right, Vice President and Deputy General Counsel, leading the Digital Trust and Security Group, which includes the Law Enforcement and National Security Team, the Digital Crime Unit, the Industry Affairs Group, all in Microsoft. Mr. Frank joined Microsoft in Paris in August 1994. There were computers back then, imagine. Mr. Frank received his AB degree from Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University and the JD from Columbia Law School. Last but not least, Ilkka Salmi, who spent many, many years in a very interesting and huge variety of different duties at the Finnish Security Intelligence Service, SUPO, dealing mainly with counter-espionage, counter-terrorism, and counter-extremism. I'm going to ask you afterwards what's the difference between counter-terrorism and counter-extremism, and isn't this just euphemism, politically correctness? Mr. Salmi was a special advisor to the Ministry of Interior, and in 2007 became Director of Security of the Security Intelligence Service, a post he left in 2011 when he took his job as the EU Intelligence and Situation Center. Nowadays, he's the Director General for Human Resources and Security at the European Commission in Brussels. So as I said, there's no dispute on the importance of intelligence. But after saying that, do the intelligence services of the democratic world, of the West, of Western Europe, of the United States, supply their citizens, their countrymen, the people who they send them to protect them, the shield they deserve? Just mentioning few of the recent failures of intelligence services. They didn't see the establishment of ISIS, and they didn't and still profoundly lack intelligence of what is happening in Raqqa and Mosul. They didn't know about the coming invasion of Russia to Crimea, to Ukraine, and then to Syria. Europe sustains attack after attack of terrorism. Most of these attacks are not prevented, and if prevented, in most cases, just by mere coincidence and luck. Two bears, one called Cozy Bear, the other one Fancy Bear, APT 21 and APT 28 and 29, attacked the German Bundestag and later the Democratic Party in the United States. Both allegedly belonged to Russian intelligence. Nothing was done to stop them. North Korea, the West doesn't have a clear idea what is happening in North Korea, and this real empire of evil is surprising the West again and again in their moves. And last, an ongoing investigation in the United States of the alleged inappropriate connection between Russian intelligence and people around Mr. Trump. And lately, news that Mr. Trump leaked sensitive Israeli intelligence that he was not supposed to share with anyone outside the United States to the Russian foreign minister. And this is just, a brief list. Secretary Chertoff, looking at the last attack in Manchester, don't you think that this is another proof, that the Western intelligence is not supplying the shield, the protection the citizens deserve?
Well, first let me begin by welcoming the panel. I think it's a great topic for discussion. I also want to again say publicly that my condolences go to the family members who lost loved ones and those who were wounded in the attack in Manchester, which was even more evil than the average terrorist attack because it really targeted children. I mean, it's about as nefarious as you can imagine. Let me begin by saying this. Intelligence actually doesn't protect people. Intelligence provides information to those who have the responsibility to protect. And many of the, quote, failures you've described are not failures of what I would say are collection or analysis. They're failures of people either to operationalize what they were told or failures to appreciate the value because of people being wedded to their own narrative or their own view of events. So I'll give you just some examples. You talk about the issue of rise of ISIS. I think a significant part of the problem there was, I'm going to be critical of my own country, the administration at the time was wedded to a narrative that they were putting out that bin Laden is dead, terrorism is done, we won, look how great we are. And as a consequence...
So as the professor said, terrorism is no longer relevant.
And I think therefore they were perhaps induced to overlook the signs they were getting from the intelligence community that actually terrorism wasn't done, it had simply morphed to the next iteration. Then there are problems with operationalizing intelligence. Someone is in fact identified, and then they can't follow through with it. And again, the open reporting on Manchester is that the individual who appears to be the suicide bomber was on the radar screen. In fact, people in the community identified him as someone who's becoming radicalized. They looked at him, and because all they could do was either decide, can he be arrested or not, and once they said he couldn't be arrested, they kind of stopped. And I think, how do you deal with that issue of someone who's not committed a crime yet, but is maybe gestating a crime? I think that's a challenge of operationalizing intelligence. And then finally, you do have cases where something is missed or the analysis is incorrect, but I think it's important not to put it all on the intelligence community. And in the case of Manchester, I think the failure to appreciate, you have to have a way to monitor people, even if you can't arrest them. I think that was really where there was maybe a lapse.
Thank you. Mr. Schuf, two quick questions. What is the level of alert in the Netherlands now, following Britain's elevation to their threat level to critical? And second, think that some of what Secretary Chertoff just referred need to have better legislation, or at least different legislation, and that legislation might lead to some violation of basic human rights. What are you doing in the Netherlands?
Well, first of all, the threat level in the Netherlands is what we call substantial. It's we got a 5-point system, and it's on 4, which means that there is a real chance of an attack in the Netherlands.
So do you have a specific intel suggesting that there might be an attack?
Now, if we have specific info,
That's 5.
it's 5,
Okay.
and then it's critical. And after the UK, we then went from 4 to 5. And we discuss it, of course. Every time when something happens, we discuss it. Every time we look very critical at the way we define our readiness. But the UK, Manchester, did not affect our system because we could not put a link to the Netherlands so far. And certainly not in relation to our alert level. And to go back to the other question,
how many people, if you can give us the number, how many people you have that are marked as dangerous, under surveillance, under any kind of scrutiny in the Netherlands?
Well, as intelligence normally does, we don't give those figures. But we have.
There are no journalists here. It's just between us.
Oh, I'm absolutely sure. It's on TV, right? Although it's closed circuit. No, but we have 280 foreign terrorist fighters into the Syria-Iraq area related to ISIS. Probably 180, 190 are still there. And when ISIS is going to be scattered one day or another, it will not be defeated, it will be scattered. They will probably return to Europe, return to the Netherlands, or they will stay in that area, or they will go to another fighting area, like Libya, for example.
And as per the legislation?
Well, our legislation, yeah, the question of the legislation, but let me put one other thing. I mean, we also look at radicals. And there is, but we were going to ask the question to the last panel member, but there is a relation between extremism and terrorism, although it's not every extremist is going to be a terrorist. But it's very important to look at the radicals and to extremists. And we think in the Netherlands we have about a few hundred direct followers of the foreign terrorist fighters in relation to ISIS, and probably 1,000, 1,500 which we care about, let's put it that way. And they didn't do anything wrong. And we are very closely looking, and that before I go to the legislation, I want to say something about Michael Chertoff also mentioned. I mean, we are looking into people who didn't do anything. So from the law enforcement, from the police, or from the prosecutor, we cannot act. So therefore we have intelligence, but we also have something different. And that's case management. At the local level, we identify people who we worry about. And then we talk, and the police and prosecutor is involved, but the local community, local government is the most important player together with education, social welfare, parents, neighborhood policing, in seeing how can we intervene before they really radicalize. And if they're really radicalized and if they become a danger, if you think that they are going to travel to Syria, Iraq, or some other place as a foreign terrorist fighter, we will probably intervene with the police or someone. So that's very important. And as of now, actually today in Dutch newspapers, there is a big debate whether we are not violating privacy in discussing these people who didn't do anything, but just took attention of government because they maybe could be radicalizing. And we think we are on the right path, because if we don't intervene, they will probably radicalize even further. So there maybe we should adapt a little bit.
When you say intervene, sorry for interrupting. So when you say intervene, it means calling them for some sort of a conversation?
Yeah, conversation, or talk with their teachers, or talk with a sports club, or so that we somehow, before punishing them, maybe a little bit of help would prevent them from becoming radicalized.
Thank you.
So it's a carrot and stick approach.
Mr. Frank, we have witnessed a series of attacks against private and government institutions, cyber attacks. Microsoft is also under attack?
Well, Microsoft, we have a fairly ubiquitous footprint, and so our customers are, there's a number of customers that we have. And
A number is an understatement.
yes, our products are widely used. And so the most recent WannaCry attack did impact many of our customers.
Just to tell the audience, WannaCry is the virus that attacked many medical institutions in Britain and worldwide last 2 weeks ago.
Right. And WannaCry was, has the story of apparently the U.S. NSA had discovered a vulnerability. We don't know when. And then also we don't know when they lost control of it. But we do know it appeared with a sort of black hats group on the web. And we then believe that it was some nation state that weaponized the code and released it just about 3 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a few different issues there, but one of them is we've long encouraged governments when they discover vulnerabilities in software that we're collectively all better off if they're disclosed responsibly to the vendor so that they can be patched. And in fact, so we did learn about this and issued a patch in March. And so machines that were patched, Windows 7's machines, were not vulnerable to the attack. Windows 7 machines that were not patched were vulnerable to it. Windows 8, Windows 10 machines, the kernel had been hardened so they weren't susceptible to the attack. But there's the issue of responsible disclosure. And then there's the other issue of what's reportedly a state actor attacking civilian infrastructure. And there's good work going on. The Dutch government is sponsoring a study along with East West Institute and the Institute for International Studies or Strategic Studies in The Hague. The UN group of government experts is also trying to come out with a report in the next few weeks with some norms about government conduct. And those are very important steps to take because I think we can all agree that there's really no point. I mean, government should not be attacking civilians and civilian infrastructures or banking infrastructures, especially in times of peace. But as we spent some time working on this process.
But they are being attacked, and the question still remains: do you think that private companies, private individuals, should get state defense, as they have, policemen patrolling the street and defending from criminals, or big companies like Microsoft or like whatever, AT&T, need to have their own intelligence service to defend themselves because the CIA does and the FBI doesn't do that?
Well, we do in fact have an extensive group of analysts who follow all the advanced persistent threats. So in this case, we're going out with a call for industry to collaborate more so that we can share information and agree to responsible practices. I mean, first of all, it's important that technology companies be trusted by pledging that they're going to be 100% committed to defense and 0% offense. And so at Microsoft, that's an easy position for us to take. Similarly, we're not going to put back doors in commercial products, right? That's, again, an easy position for us to take, but we need industry to do that.
Well,
but
you make note, but maybe intelligence service will in order to defend them.
Well, we're not going to cooperate with it, right? And if intelligence services want to, if they want to, I mean, governments are going to conduct their intelligence work, but they should not be attacking civilians in time of peace, especially in these broad attacks. And we're trying to work more cooperatively as an industry on attribution, because one of the biggest challenges is there's sort of finger pointing, but everybody denies that they did anything. And yet we have a great deal of scientific information from the telemetry from all those Windows devices that are hooked up to the internet. And so we can share that with, ideally, an independent agency, can be industry sponsored, that can gather the scientific data from a variety of parties and publish scientific analysis that will let people reach conclusions about who's behind it. And that can help create more accountability in the system so that governments can respond with more confidence. And perhaps we hope over time governments will not take some of these actions.
Mr. Salmi, in order to have good intelligence, you need to have good people. In order to have good people, you need to have good training. What, according to your assessment, is the, I would say, the level of quality training for intelligence operative in Europe?
Thank you. First of all, I want to underline one clear thing where if you look into the Lisbon Treaty, which states that the national security belongs to the competence of the member states. So this also reflects in a way that the services, the member states themselves have the responsibility to organize the training the way they see fit. And then again, having looked this from the European perspective and a level, we do have a difference between the United States, for example, where in the US there is, let's say, a well-founded and long-lasting tradition in intelligence, in the intelligence culture training, and also how to, let's say, inform and teach the intelligence users as well, or educate them how to use intelligence in the wisest way. I do feel that also on the European level, that's probably a thing which is done in one way in all the member states. I mean, there's certainly not a one size which fits all. I would imagine they all have their own systems. On the European level, and especially in this era when we have the Schengen Agreement in place, we have the free movement of people, we have common challenges in Europe, we have to look into what we can do on an EU level in cooperation with the member states. And this is exactly what we tried to do over the past years, is to actually come up with a certain intelligence culture in the EU and among the EU institutions with the help of the services. And as I said, I would love to see, at least in Brussels, that we have a certain way of doing things, and the member states would be very well aware how these things are done, what do we expect, how we could then again contribute back to the member states. But indeed, it varies tremendously, and there's a long way to go.
This was a long and diplomatic answer to my question on the level of their training.
Yeah.
Mr. Salmi, are they well trained?
I would say that most of the services that I have been working with, actually all of them are very well trained. Of course, the capabilities do change tremendously. I mean, if you take one of the bigger member states, bigger services, they certainly have much more resources than like the service that I know best, where I served for 2 decades, which is a small service and relies on
What is
partners.
the sphere that needs, I would say, the better empowerment? The sphere of intelligence, SIGINT, vision, human, collection of intelligence, technology?
That's probably, again, an issue that, you can't really give one definitive answer. I mean, it, again, varies from one service to another. I think one thing which might or could be very helpful would be that how is the analytical product produced? What sort of a methodology do you use? This is actually a quite safe field for those services to cooperate, and that's already done to a certain extent. And then again, in a smaller groups within the EU member states, for example, and let's say like among the Nordic countries or what have you, you have similar societies, similar legislation and the legal framework, which allows you to cooperate probably in much more in depth than you could with some other member states, for example.
Secretary Chertoff, you came to be the Secretary of Homeland Security in difficult times. And one of the main tasks was to have a much better coordination between the different, I think, 14 different intelligence agencies. What was the main thing, the main lesson that you can inherit to your European counterparts on coordination?
Well, I would say that, of course, it was, in terms of coordinating within the department, as the secretary, I had the authority to simply order people to do things, so that makes it somewhat easier. The harder thing is among different departments, and certainly harder still is across national boundaries. But I think there are a number of things you can do. First of all, you need to make sure you have a common understanding, not just of the threat, but of what it is you're trying to achieve and the tools you have to achieve it. That means, for example, a common language, standard approaches to things, standard ways of evaluating things, and things of that sort. Second, I think you need to do what in the military is called, make sure people understand commander's intent, understand what the mission is, what it is you have to accomplish. You don't want to micromanage all your components, but you do want to give them clarity about what they're trying to achieve, and also have cross-fertilization. To take an example, not in the area of terrorism, but in the area of mass migration. When I came in, we had a system where we had so many people crossing the border that we were apprehending that we didn't have enough space to detain them. So most of them were released and they never showed up for hearings. So we had two choices. One is we can really spend a lot of money and build a lot more beds, or we can figure out how do you change the system so that you can move people who are apprehended, who don't belong in the country, back to where they came from more quickly. So that was the objective. And we brought in the various component elements, those who apprehend at the border, those who manage detention, those who arrange for repatriation. And we looked at the system end to end. We recognized that if we accelerated the repatriation process to make it contemporaneous with the apprehension process, we could cut by 2/3 the amount of time it took to send somebody back, which was like tripling the beds. And within less than a year, we had eliminated the need to release people because of lack of bed space. So that's an example of how you coordinate and operationalize an objective.
Are you satisfied with the level of coordination between the inside the U.S. intelligence community today? Do you think that there's a much lesser risk that, God forbid, another September 11 occur?
I think it's far better than it was because we built a culture of sharing, although I will tell you, after 9/11, there was a real effort to get people to push their intelligence out. Then we had the Snowden episode. That
Now they
caused,
need to keep in.
yeah, and that caused people to say, wait a second, let's keep it to ourselves. And I still think we're trying to find the happy medium. The good news is there are some technical things that can be done to data that allow people to see it, but not necessarily to download it or manipulate it. And those tools allow you to put much more finely grained rules in place when you share data.
And if we had General Michael Hayden, who works with you, standing here, he would say, and I quote from an interview that he gave me, that Snowden affair was the one single most severe hemorrhaging in the history of American intelligence.
I think that's probably right. And, you know, and some of what he put out, of course, was exaggerated. But it went well beyond what he was complaining about, which was a particular program to collect metadata on a wide scale. He put things out there that touched on all kinds of issues that have no civil liberties component, but really seemed designed largely to damage the U.S. and its relations with allies, to damage U.S. companies, to create a lack of trust. And it will not have escaped your notice that while he's been very critical of the U.S., he's safely ensconced in Russia, not necessarily known as the paragon of civil liberties around the globe. So you can draw your own conclusion from that.
And I can support it. I was part of the Spiegel team that analyzed much of the documents that Snowden stole and later gave to some journalists, and mainly and probably to Russian intelligence. And much of that did not relate to violation of civil rights. And there was even a discussion inside the group of journalists and commentators what to release among the 1.2 million documents that he leaked. My claim was that if you leak documents that relate to an NSA, CIA hunt for the real bad guys, proliferated, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, then you basically jeopardize the legitimacy of the whole project. I can understand a German journalist who is somewhat furious to see that the NSA is hacking into the phone of the chancellor, but to leak information about how the NSA is following proliferators of nuclear weapon, this is something else. But coordination inside the American intelligence agency is one thing, and Ilka Salmi, to have coordination inside Europe is another thing. And I have a German high-rank official said, we wanted to have a European CIA, but we failed. We realized that this is not doable. We are not being able to share the information and to bridge all the logistical, linguistic, and other things. So what's next? How do you create a CIA in Europe, if you want to create one?
Indeed, that's very much a political issue, of course, above my pay grade to decide whether there's a political will to do that or not. But there are a few, as I mentioned, there are a few limitations or legal issues that we have to tackle first. As I said, the Lisbon Treaty quite clearly states that the national security falls under the competence of the member states. This again means that the member states will organize their security, whether it's countering terrorism or intelligence activities, what have you, the way they wish to do that. At the same time, I truly believe that there is a room for, let's say, multilateral sharing of intelligence within the EU and probably even a bit wider. And there is already a small nucleus in that sort, which is the EU's INTCEN, which is the EU Intelligence and Situation Center, which is a small team of roughly a couple of hundred of people in Brussels today, which basically shares and assesses strategic intelligence shared by the member states. They don't have any collection capability of their own, but they do get contributions from the member states, which then in turn, combined with open source intelligence and any publicly available information, what have you, is produced into assessments which are then shared with the political decision makers on Brussels level. So we do have a small, let's say a small team already which exists, but I want to underline, it does not have any operational nor tactical role in that sense. And this again, it's not only about Lisbon Treaty, it's also the national legislations in place. I mean, the devil's in the detail in this. If you start looking into who shall control the use of coercive measures in one of the member states, whether it should be done somewhere on an EU level or on a national level, today the answer is very clear. It's the national level which decides on that. As I said, I served as the head of INTCEN for 5 years, and what I could see over those years was that actually the willingness to share increased tremendously. I mean, both quantity-wise and quality-wise from the contributions from the member states, as there was also an understanding that this is an added value for some of the member states at least. Let me go back to the fact, coming from Finland and one of the smaller member states, I can imagine that the Finnish politicians as well as the security authorities did benefit from the contributions and assessments that were done by EU INTCEN on the EU level. So it was a two-way street. But this is a starting point. I do not personally see that in a short or medium, probably not even in the long term, there would be a trend to go towards an European CIA, which would be an EU institution, let's put it that way. The Dutch presidency took an excellent initiative some years ago to establish a cooperation in countering terrorism, which is more of on an operational level. And of course, my colleague.
So we go to Dick Schoof. Don't you think that you, not you personally, but European intelligence services are now losing the war when we are talking about attacks inside Europe? Maybe in contradiction to the fact that Daesh, that ISIS is losing its ground in Raqqa at Mosul.
I think the intelligence service in Europe, specifically after the Brussels attack, did a huge effort with the counterterrorism group, which is all the European intelligence services are working together with Norwegian and Switzerland. They got a platform and a database in The Hague, actually. It was established already after 9/11, but it was reanimated, and I think very successfully. And the information is still owned by every national intelligence service, but the information is actually shared because they have the platform, they have the database, they have liaisons of every country in a very secure and safe place, to put it that way, and they make big achievements. And every intelligence services, I think it's fair to say, after Paris, after Brussels, we saw in the CDG, but also in Europol, at the ECTC, the European Counterterrorist Center, an enormous amount of data suddenly flowing. I mean, intelligence law enforcement almost overflowed
it by used. Can you, if you cannot tell us the specifics, but do you know of specific attacks that were stopped thanks to that flow of intelligence between different countries?
I think the DTG did a good work in that, yes. And I think that some of the arrests that were taking place in European countries were directly related to the work of the TTG group. Yes, absolutely. So, but it's always difficult to say if you lose ground, if you're in the midst of the battle, to put it that way. But I think the intelligence services and the law enforcement agencies, they are working more together than ever. And I think a discussion about institutional reform will probably distract us from really operational cooperation. So we put a lot of effort, and also during the Dutch presidency is already mentioned, on operational cooperation. Not only through the counterterrorism group, but also by introducing the so-called roadmap on information sharing, which was about counterterrorism, about border, and about organized crime, because we see all these relations. And it was a very practical roadmap. And the roadmap is still the guiding principle for the EU in trying to achieve operational cooperation. The Slovak presidency took it further, Maltese now, and Estland will probably, well, not probably, I'm sure, they will take it up further. Yeah.
Thank you. We will take few questions from the audience in a minute. Just before that, John Frank, is this from a technological point of view, is this doable? Can you create one data system, one database that would bridge the linguistic difficulties and secrecy, so we won't end up with a European Snowden, God forbid, then to have all intelligence agencies connected to one single pipeline, share it, enjoy it, and be able to stop the next terrorist attack?
I think when you do a software development project, the first thing you do is you sit down and figure out what you're trying to accomplish. What are the requirements? And Secretary Chertoff, working with GlobSec, has just produced a paper which advances the state of the art in thinking about, well, how should an information sharing system work so that you can have confidence that information you're sharing is going to be used but not abused, and you can retain control over it. It won't be passed on. And I commend that paper as the basis for further work to make practical the implementations of that. But generally, technology can do most everything, and especially we're seeing some very good advances, like machine translation. It's not going to be perfect, but the application of artificial intelligence to machine translation has significantly increased the accuracy to the point that it's quite usable. And if we start with, again, more defining a technological standard, and learning from the work done in the United States or in Canada on different applications, you can come up with reasonably good systems that let you tag information, that create a hash, and so if you're on the internet, if you're on the network, you can say, I want to do a check on John Frank, and it'll be a hash, and the other side will get a hash, and if it's a positive, it'll get a flag, and then you can make a request, and there's something there. But you maintain confidentiality in the meantime. And there's lots of good, thoughtful advances applying commercial off-the-shelf technology that are need to be put together. But I'm confident that the system that's outlined in the paper the Secretary Chertoff's group put together, it's not science fiction. It's something that can be done.
And the paper called towards Transatlantic Counterterrorism Center of Excellence says, among many other important things, many of the failings identified occurred due to problems with standardization, legislation, and organizational trust. And your final recommendation was to create a Transatlantic Counterterrorism Center of Excellence to accelerate tactical and operational standardization. Hopefully this will happen. Questions from the audience, please. Please.
My name is Julian Fot. I'm from Romania. Look, I disagree with our moderator blaming intelligence services for Crimea for Ukraine. I mean, first of all, we have to put in our discussion the issue of the decision maker, because in a democratic society, the intelligence services, always act based on political guidance. And in my opinion, we have a problem with some of the guidance coming from our decision makers. Crimea is mainly, first of all, a failure in strategic thinking, because Russia for a very long time it was considered to be a weak and irrelevant country. And then we discovered that they are able to do a lot of bad things. So my question for the panel is, how can we speak about improving the results of our intelligence services without bringing the discussion, the very, very important role played by the politicians, because including when it comes to the fight against terrorism. I think that the issues have to be addressed from a much more broader perspective. Thank you.
So we are talking about the interface, very sensitive interface between the chiefs of the intelligence and the chief of the political level. Secretary Chertoff.
I think there are two issues. First of all, I'm in agreement. A lot of blame is laid at the door of the intelligence community. It's really the decision makers. At one level, I think we need to educate decision makers about how to understand what intelligence is. It is not a crystal ball. It cannot guarantee you that what you're going to know what the future is. And understanding the rules of the road in terms of appreciating the value and the limitations of intelligence, also understanding how to handle it properly. These are, I think, things we can educate people about. But I think the issue you're raising is at a higher level issue. In the end, it's about facing facts that are unpleasant or difficult facts. And as I said earlier in the case of ISIS, but I think it's also true with respect to Russia, for all kinds of reasons, I think many decision makers wanted to convince themselves that Russia was, to quote former President Obama, a regional power. That statement not only irritated the living daylights out of the Russians and probably provoked a lot of bad behavior, but it also, again, creates a mindset where you tend to look at the intelligence through the prism of what you would like to believe is true. And as my late father used to say, the one thing you can't do is kid yourself. So I think part of what politicians need to understand is they need to be able to step out of their own preconceptions and wishful thinking and understand intelligence in a more objective and dispassionate way.
Any other remarks?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, but I think don't kid yourself. I mean, that's a good one. I think the professionalism of the intelligence services is key to that. As a coordinator in the Netherlands, I'm right between the politicians and the intelligence services and law enforcement, and somehow we made an arrangement.
So do you like to work more with the politicians or with your subordinates in the intelligence service?
I've probably with both, because I'm the middleman, you might say. But what is important in relation to terrorism is that we made an arrangement that, for example, the level of alert in the Netherlands is not a political decision, but it's the decision of the coordinator. And that's important. The assessment we make on counterterrorism and on terrorism, we have a public and a secret. It is sent out every 4 months together with all the intelligence services, and it is a professional piece of paper. So it's not under political influence. We publish it, and not the politician. So that's, and I think that more or less helps, at least in the Netherlands, to create the right discussions between the decision making and the political level and the professionalism of the intelligence services.
But the tools that are adopted by, and I refer to what Secretary Chertoff said before, that it's not just the gathering of the intelligence, but what you do with the intelligence. The tools that are chosen how to fight against terrorism are usually authorized or selected by the political level. The country I come from, in Israel, decided that it can use methods of targeted killing, assassinations, and tortures. This is a big decision that was taken by the politicians and many other violations of civil rights in order to defeat terrorism. And I think the Israeli intelligence community has been very successful in much of its effort. So, Mr. Salmi, do you think that your country or Europe maybe should employ other tools? For example, should Europe be part of targeted assassination or targeted killing operations of the United States and Britain in Syria and Iraq against Daesh?
As you rightly pointed out, it's a political decision, which I very much doubt, because I think it will go very much against some of the values that at least the EU stands for. And on the behalf of Finland, even if I do not represent that country or any agencies anymore, I would see that very unlikely to happen. But just if I may, just very quick remark concerning the issue with, let's say, the early warning and the early action. It's not always an intelligence failure. It's always a question that, okay, what then, when the sometimes uncomfortable truth has been put on the table? Who acts and how and when and with what sort of a means? That's clearly an issue. And then more on, let's say, on a tactical level, I would say that what we did in Inten was that we actually started back in 2012 a training, what we call the intelligence for intelligence users, which basically was in order to make the EU level decision makers to understand what the intelligence can do, at least what the intent could do for them, and what sort of a means we had
And do you think
available.
that today they are less skeptical about the impact of intelligence, the assistance intelligence can give them?
It certainly had a very
Well,
positive impact, yes.
Better educated politicians.
In that sense, at least as far as intelligence is concerned.
Secretary Chertoff, any remark from you on the use of targeted killing?
Well, it's better than untargeted killing. I mean, the reality is if you're in war, you do have to kill the enemy. And if you can be precise and not have innocent people caught up in it, I think that's a good thing.
Mr. Schiff, if you capture a terrorist, you know that he is a ticking bomb. He knows where's the next bombing going to take place. Something maybe is happening in the UK right now. Would you justify the use of special measures during the interrogation?
Well, if it's not in accordance with our law, clear as that.
People would say you should change the law because the situation changed.
Yeah, but as long as the law is not changed, we will not do.
You know, there was an incident, I remember when this debate was raging many years ago. There was an incident, I believe it was in Germany, where a police chief apprehended the kidnapper of a girl. The girl had been buried alive. She was not going to be able to survive buried alive without food and water and adequate air. And at some point in interrogating the kidnapper, I think the police chief pulled out a gun and said, "I'm going to kill you if you don't tell me where she is," which is technically the definition of torture. And he did tell the police chief, and he got there too late. They couldn't save her. But if you think about that scenario, part of the debate about interrogation often gets into the question about whether it's effective or not. But that's a case where it was effective. And maybe if the police chief had pulled the gun out a little earlier, the girl would have been saved. So putting aside whether you want to embody in the law, there's always a question I think people are going to face, a moral question about, in that circumstance, how do you make the decision?
What do you do?
Yeah.
More questions, please.
Yes, hi. My name is Brooks Tigner. I'm EU NATO analyst for Jane's Defense in Brussels. We hear a lot about how the EU and NATO need to step up their exchange of intel.
And that NATO is not obsolete.
Yeah, yes. And also that this must include, of course, cyber intel attack. But the amount of intel that's actually exchanged between the two is very limited. It's limited to masked information, metrics about malware, etc. It doesn't go much beyond that because, and I've had my NATO experts tell me this point blank and quite recently for two reasons. One, there aren't that many people at the EU who are cleared to NATO standards to receive it. And secondly, the EU's security clearance procedures for vetting personnel lower down in the bureaucracy certainly don't meet NATO standards. So my question to you, Mr. Salmi, how do you react to that? And secondly, what is the EU doing about that and how soon? Thank you.
Indeed, if I may, just very quickly. First of all, partially I do agree. First of all, the one thing what we have with the EU officials is that very few, I think the ratio is somewhere like 1/5 of the officials are security vetted. They have a clearance. That's the starting point. The second issue is indeed that how do we carry out those screenings is actually with the help of the member states. We always go back to the member state in question. If it's a Finnish citizen, we'll go back to the Finnish authorities, etc. What we have just started with the Belgians last year actually is a screening procedure where there's a memorandum of understanding with the Belgians so that we can now really screen more of our staff with them. Also it's not a security clearance as such, but it's something a little lower than that. I hope that this will help out the issue, and indeed there is constant discussion between the NATO and EU what can and what could be shared and by whom. Then again, I would say that there is a sufficient number of people with a relevant level of clearance on the EU side as well. So I don't see that should be the biggest bottleneck in that cooperation.
It's not just terrorist risk. Ed Lucas of The Economist just joined us, and he was one of the first to warn of the Russian threat. To the extent that even Snowden was maybe operated by Russian intelligence. Jones Frank do you see a state-level cyber attacks that maybe you're able to connect to Russian or Chinese or even Iranian intelligence?
There's no doubt that there are state-sponsored cyber activities that should not be taking place. And you know, that we do believe that there ought to be a basis for better attribution. And as a company, some of these governments are our customers. And you know, we have telemetry data, we've got forensic malware analysis, and we've got a set of information that's different from often what governments have from their signals intelligence or human intelligence. And you know, we think it's important to create some way that there can be objectively, people can feel more confident about making an attribution. And so whether industry, we'll start as industry standing up an organization, and if governments choose to share that information with the computer scientist at that organization, that's fine. But you know, I think the realities are that, you know, we've seen that the Obama administration analysis of why they believe the Russians were the ones hacking the DNC, it was fairly thin in terms of what they actually put out. And you know, I think.
So you're not sure that it was Russian military
I'm not
intelligence?
saying that at all. I'm just saying that governments have reasons not to disclose a great deal of information that may reveal their sources and methods. And so, you know, but we can, if we collectively, with us and other major technology companies that observe carefully what's happening, can share information, and we can have that published. Governments can add their own.
Yeah, but in return, the governments would ask you or a private company that was just attacked to let their virtual spies or cops go into their systems and check what happened, to do the forensic. And maybe even have a legislation that would permit the intelligence agency to do the forensic post-attack without notifying the company, which is something that you object.
Right, of course, but governments can act. A lot of this information is on the open internet, so you can. I mean, in a sense, one can access much of this information. But we've got a very extensive information sharing program where we share threat intelligence with national governments through their certs, through banks, and through ISPs, and you know, trying to ensure that, you know, for example, botnet information is shared because that is a source of indirectly of many of the attacks. So we do publish a great deal of information. We work closely, and I've got to say, industry. This is not something where, you know, we view it as primarily a competitive issue. We view it as a, you know, it's in the interest of our industry together, and so the level of cooperation between us and people you would consider to be competitors is surprisingly high.
Dikshof, are you afraid that Russia would cyber attack the Netherlands?
Well, afraid is not my language.
Concerned?
But
Intrigued?
Well, intrigued is too diplomatic. No, we're sure that actually we also publish our cyber threats, and we are sure that Russia, China, Iran have cyber attacks, have cyber espionage on our research and developments, our companies, our government, and probably are trying to enter our vital infrastructure. Not to act, but to prepare to act. So we are working very hard with our cyber security center and also with intelligence services and law enforcement to build up a resistant detection network and also a response network. But we are a small country, so we have to be wise when we respond.
Secretary Chertoff, did you ever dream that Russia would meddle inside U.S. elections?
Well, actually, I mean, I'm not sure "dream" is the right word. I can't say I was. I cannot say I was shocked. Partly because having attended GlobSec sessions over past years, actually, you know, this has been a phenomenon in Central Europe and Western Europe.
So you're saying that in order to know what would happen in 2 years, we need to be in GlobSec today?
Well, I mean, it was actually a great forewarning. I mean, and I remember going back to the States and telling people, this is an issue in Europe and it's actually affecting public opinion. And people looked at me like I was having flashbacks to the Cold War. I think the fact that the Russians hacked into political databases, that's gone on for years. I mean, that's espionage. What was different is the apparent release of that information to mold public opinion. I don't know that it had an effect on the outcome, but I suspect what it will do is encourage behavior like this in the future. And I think
And
now
maybe
it's
it happened in France.
Right, and now I think what you're seeing, what would take it to the next level would be two additional things. If, as in France, they not only released things, but they released phony things, altered documents, altered photographs, that would then take it to the next level. And finally, there's a growing concern about the integrity of the voting process itself. If you move to a completely electronic process, and someone was able to hack into the database or hack into the network, you could actually have a question about the election. A couple of years ago in the Ukraine, apparently, Russians hacked into the television, one of the television networks. What they were going to try to do was affect the way the network reported the outcome of the race where there was a pro-Russian candidate running for president. I think they understood at the end of the day, when the actual votes were counted, the correct outcome would be revealed. But I think what their calculation is that the discrepancy would cause people to doubt which was true and which was false. And in many ways, when you look at Russian information operations, I don't know that it's necessarily that they think they're going to persuade most people that what they're putting out is true, as much as it is they're going to persuade most people nothing can be trusted. And that's exactly the undermining of institutions, which creates a lot of damage.
This is a gloomy consequence. Ed, please.
Very brief question to you and then a question to the panel. If this happens in Germany, will the German media run around like headless chickens like the American media did, not realizing that the political system is under attack and just reporting whatever has been stolen from the emails of the German politicians? Or will they behave like the French media, which behaved very responsibly and said someone's attacking our political system and we're not going to cooperate? So while you think about that, my question to the panel is, you're talking as if technology has stopped, but yet what we have witnessed over the last 15 years, an enormous technological change which has already turned the world of intelligence upside down once. And I suspect it's going to do so again. So I'd like to ask you just to cast your minds forward to 5 years' time, when we've really got big data, facial recognition algorithms really working. So with one photo of one person, you can check instantly, are they who they say they are? That's going to make traditional cross-border human intelligence really difficult. It's the end of the cover identity, which has been the basis of intelligence since the Bible. It's much harder to keep secrets. We've seen not just with Snowden, with shadow brokers, things that were the absolute crown jewels, high side, protected by data diodes, no way you can hack into that network, and they're coming out of NSA and being released on the internet, which seems it's really hard to collect, to keep secrets. On the other hand, much easier, perhaps, to obtain those secrets electronically. So I'd like to ask you to reflect on when we're talking about this in 5 years' time, what are we going to be talking about in regards to technological change?
Thank you. One word about the coverage in the German press, which I'm not going to be the judge of, and I don't read German, but there was a wonderful report that was just issued, a cover story by Die Zeit, Holger Stark in Die Zeit, that was published in English as well, which I highly recommend reading, about how APT-29, Cozy Bear, and Fancy Bear both infiltrated German parliament and German political system and stole gigas of information that yet didn't surface. There's the risk and the concern and the intrigued people that are fearing that this is going to be used against, for example, Chancellor Merkel in the upcoming elections. And I want to sharpen and add to that question, are we witnessing, following biometric systems, are we witnessing the end of human intelligence? Secretary General.
Well, first of all, let me say I think we're already seeing a tremendous change in the volume of what is collected and the analytical use that can be made out of what is collected. And I think in many ways it's going to be a paradise for intelligence agencies. Now, you're going to lose human intelligence. You may lose a lot of the kind of James Bond type of thing where someone masquerades as somebody else and, goes under deep cover. But a lot of human intelligence.
But Aston Martin is producing a Jeep that would
Right.
be much more reasonable price. So
Than
it's
the
gonna be
S, right,
sold to
yes.
many more people.
But I do think what you'll continue to see, what I think has always been the backbone of human intelligence, which is people who are legitimately in a place for whatever reason, whether it's a noble reason or an ignoble reason, coming forward to relay information about what's going on. So I think you'll see changes in the way human is collected and transmitted, but I'm confident you're going to continue to see that as an important dimension of intelligence.
Okay. Yes, please.
Just a couple comments. I mean, I think there's two challenges. A lot of things you mentioned as future exist today. The facial recognition quality is very good, and given the power of cloud computing and the extensibility of data, it's not hard. There's two challenges. One is a lot of the commercial technologies trying to figure out how to make it work in a secure world, figuring out how to balance that, and it can be done, but there's some work there. The second one is more on the political judgments, and democratic parliaments need to make decisions about how they feel on some of these issues, and certainly technology can be applied to make the choice closer through data minimization, essentially, and so there can be things done to advance that. But those are the two areas where I see are more the challenge than actually artificial intelligence and that technology.
John Frank, in yes or no, do you think that there will be a day when someone will be able to build a system that could cheat on biometrics?
Oh, undoubtedly. There's always going to be, I guess, one of the biometric indicators we all use are fingerprints, and yet I believe it was reported that the Chinese stole the fingerprints of everybody with a security clearance in the United States. So, how do you've got every system.
So maybe there's still a future for James Bond.
But let me
Yes,
give you
please.
an example of exactly how things compensate for that. So the concern is someone's going to take a fingerprint, make a latex print. I am advising a company that actually uses ultrasound to identify fingerprints. So they're three-dimensional, and it can actually even detect blood flow. So a latex print is not going to work because it's not going to have the blood flow. Now, I guess you could cut someone's finger off, and before the blood stops flowing, you could use that. But good luck with that as a technique.
Well, do not try this at home, please. Yes, we had a question over there, please. And now we are going to keep it very short. Short questions, short answers.
Sure. Giray Sadık, Associate Professor. Well, you touched upon transatlantic intelligence sharing in counterterrorism, and the panel touched mostly on the issues at EU level. This Eurocentric view, do you think it's a hindrance, or to what extent it can be a hindrance in terms of considering the transnational nature of threats? With a special focus, I am asking that for non-EU NATO members, not only United States, but it can be a challenge for members like Turkey, for example. What's your opinion on that? Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Sami, could you address it?
Yeah, just to kick off with that, I think the Eurocentric view probably also comes from the fact that working for the EU, it is, at least as far as I'm concerned, was the natural approach. I do feel that when it's more than, let's say, outside the EU, whether it's a transatlantic dimension or otherwise, I think then again it's still the more bilateral cooperation or what have you, Five Eyes between some of the partners, than really the EU working with third countries. Because then again, as I mentioned, the EU today, and any intelligence or anything which is remotely resembles intelligence is actually based on member states' information and intelligence that they share with us. So always, the originator's consent going back to the sending agency or service normally leads to a situation that then the member states and their agencies will cooperate outside the EU on a bilateral basis or the way they wish. So in that sense, I don't see that there's no conflict in that sense, but as an EU level, the sharing will most likely not take place.
Of course, the conflicts could arise from the definition of what is a terrorist and who are the common enemies. Question over there, please.
Hi, I'm Jakub Janda from European Values Think Tank in Prague. We are on the Kremlin Watch program, and I want to ask a very single thing. Do you think that, let's say, electoral process should be put within the framework of national critical infrastructure? Why I'm asking that is that many intelligence agencies and national security establishments in Europe are thinking in this direction, not only about protecting the process itself, the voting, but the campaigns. They are discussing it, they are training them. So how far should intelligence agencies go to protect the electoral process in the national context? Thank you.
Tikshu, could you address it? Just for one remark before that, I know that there's a new entity in Israel called the National Cyber Bureau, which basically coordinate all the cyber defense activities of the country. And they have run their own research, and they came to the conclusion that voting and election should not be fully automatic and fully electronic. They should leave with the notes or with making a V or on some written list, and never go to a fully automatic because it's too risky. Dikshu, please.
Yeah, well, we just had elections, and we had a special team which was formed by intelligence police and my office to see with the different parties, with the parliament, if there was any influence of any state actor, specifically Russia. So we already made a step, and in the end, the process was there was no computer involved in anything, not even in the counting process, because of the fear that there might be influence even on the counting. But I think that will not work out in the long term. So there will be intelligence and others will be involved as the election process as a part of our vital infrastructure, because we're a democratic society, and if the election process is in doubt in our country or in your country or whatever country, we are in real trouble. At the same time, intelligence and the way we try to detect state actors or otherwise influence the process, we must make very clear, probably by oversight or giving good information, that we don't go into the content of the different political parties, because then we will incriminate the process by ourselves. So that will be the balance.
Yes. The woman in the back, please.
From Cornell University. The panel opened with a comment about Intel leaks, and I'm curious to hear from the panel about how realistic it is to rein those in and prevent those from happening, and whether there's any precedent for this, and what the medium to longer term impacts on Intel sharing there would be if this continued.
Secretary Chertoff, are you afraid that following, I'm adding to the question of the lady, are you afraid that following the recent reports about leakage of information by the United States, either to the media or by the President to Foreign Minister Lavrov, countries would be hesitant to share the intelligence with the US?
Well, I mean, we've had leaks in the past. I mean, I think the bigger danger, frankly, to sharing was when you had massive theft of really highly classified stuff with Snowden. But leaks are always present. They do create a problem with sharing. Sometimes what's leaked is pretty generic and not that important, and we may overclassify some things. Sometimes what's leaked is really merely politically embarrassing. But when you're getting to something sensitive, it is problematic. And again, you can tolerate a certain amount of that, but if it gets to be a persistent pattern, it does have a negative impact.
Please.
So from a technological point of view, one can do things to lock things down a bit more. So they're still accessible to people who might find the information useful, but in a more limited way, so they can't download something, for example. And also with an audit trail of who's seen something. And certainly you can, as a network administrator, be looking for unusual patterns, using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so there are ways to try to address the risk better through technology.
Please. We're going to take two last questions. This gentleman.
Milo Jones, visiting professor. Why are we so passive? In game theory, tit for tat works well. Why is it democracies under attack and not the fragile societies that have to be authoritarian even to hold together? Why don't we go on the offensive?
Okay, and one last question, please.
Thanks. Patrick Tucker, Defense One. Question for Director Chertoff, Secretary Chertoff, excuse me. We both know we can go back to Washington, D.C. tomorrow and we'll see wildly different versions of the greatest national security threat facing the United States, depending on whether we're watching Fox or CNN or MSNBC. Do you think that politicization of intelligence is getting worse? Who do you think is the bigger culprit there? And how can the intelligence community be reformed to affect that while still being transparent and accountable to lawmakers? Thanks.
Secretary Chertoff, why don't you address this question and then the question of retaliation?
So I don't think the intelligence is getting politicized. I think the reporting about what the intelligence community says is getting politicized. And that's really a media issue. It's not an intelligence community
I'm not sure
issue.
that President Trump would agree with you.
Well, I still hold to my belief. I think it's. I think the community is not politicized. And they often get blamed for that when people just don't agree with what they're hearing. On the issue of retaliation, yeah, that's a complicated issue. I would say this to you. If you go to Russia, they will tell you we're interfering with their electoral system because we do things like broadcast the news and have, support democracy and talk about human rights. I'm not being facetious. They will say they will believe it. So they think they're retaliating against us. And that's a fundamental difference in worldview, which I think is very hard to reconcile. Now, if you start to ask me, if there are particular things that are done in terms of hacking or damaging systems or destroying them, then I think there are a range of measures you can take. For example, there was the theft of 500 million Yahoo accounts. And the US government did indict not only 2 criminals, but 2 FSB officers as being behind that hack. You can argue whether an indictment is that significant in this instance, but if you started to go after companies, for example, that were stealing information, or you look to apply sanctions, you have a series of tools you can use, but you also have to watch the issue of escalation, because those in glass houses have to be careful about throwing stones.
Thank you. Mr. Sami, Ilka Sami, in short, do you think that there's reasonable retaliation or reasonable countermeasures that can be applied, for example, against Russia, to make them think that there is a price tag attached to what they're doing?
Well, that's probably on the political level what the EU, on the sanctions policy and otherwise, is exactly trying to convince them that there is a price to pay on that.
Yeah. Before closing remarks, just wanted to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to invite you to the next session on the future of global free trade, starting here at the Danube space after lunch at 3:30 sharp, they said. The lunch will be served in the hotel restaurant on the ground floor. And I would like to close and have very briefly from each one of you, starting with Ilka Salmi, what do you think is the one single step that intelligence agencies need to take now to make the world a better place?
If I knew that reply, I would probably be doing something completely different. But certainly, I mean, the basis is trust, of course. And then again, I think the main issue is that between the services, you have trust in what you do, you have a common understanding, and that will certainly help things out. Because through trust, you share information, you share intelligence, which is needed. It's not only need to know, it's also need to share.
Please.
I would commend people to take up the Chertoff report of GlobSec on how to build information sharing systems that meet all the equities, and try to advance it and see if it can be operationalized.
Inshallah. Dick Schoof.
Well, I think we must not forget that terrorism is about undermining our society, our open democratic society. And even their attacks serve a purpose that's undermining our society. So the worst thing, and so the best thing intelligence and we can do is to stick to our core values of our open democratic society, even though sometimes it's very hard to do so because you want to just take your fist and punch. But nevertheless, I think it's important. If we cross that line, we will end up in a society we don't want to live in. But and I'm not saying that we should not somehow bow a little bit. but we must very keen on stick to our values.
Secretary Chertoff.
I encourage you all to read the couple of reports that the GlobSec initiative has put out, including one on having centers of excellence. If I was going to suggest one thing is I think we are usually quite good at tactical intelligence. We need to invest more in strategic intelligence, by which I mean looking at more broadly what are the long-term causes of radicalization and extremism and how do we combat them, looking geopolitically at how our adversaries or rivals use not just military tools but a whole range of tools to advantage themselves. Someone raised the question earlier about did we see what the Russians were doing coming, and it may be that we've been so focused on preventing attacks and being very tactical that we've lost a little bit of the art of bringing a broad range of subject matter experts in to look holistically at what the threat map is and to think about it strategically.
So I think that after speaking about all these manner and things and topics, we are ending with a somewhat positive view and less gloomy assessment of the future. Please join me in thanking our distinguished guests, Secretary Michael Chertoff, Dick Shu, John Frank, Ilka Salmi, for their thoughtful and innovative ideas. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Come back to the next session.